Hmm. So it was the second half of April when the cases started rising and everything started happening. Uh, I had a chat with Gautam about is there something that is being done? Can something be done, etc. So and there was this conversation that was happening among different groups. But by the end of the month, there was the group that was set up, and there was some idea about how this can be worked, because based on the experience of the first wave, people knew who works in which areas, which organizations, which activists work where, etc. So you knew that you can mobilize legitimate demand, and you knew where demand would come from as well. So it was a matter of getting resources, figuring out a way of working, because it wasn't possible to work physically like in the first wave, right? So that took a little bit of time, but I think it was set up in the last week of the group was set up in the last week of April, and deliveries started the first week of May. So it kind of kind of got developed and defined as we went along, as we were setting up processes, etc. So, but my role was effectively to basically coordinate the functioning of the deliveries that would go out. So there was dry rations that were being delivered as ration kits, for which you would get demands from various civil society organizations, activists, etc. From across Delhi. We would pool it in a sheet, in a Google sheet. There would be, I think there were three other people who were helping me, along with Gautam, of course. And basically, so we'd pool it. We'd had some vendors who we'd give orders to. We would set up delivery routes for them, etc. In conversation with them, and make sure that they are completed. So every week we'd take demands from the group, and every week, next week we'd meet. We'd tell them all of this has been done, new demands, like that. So that was coordinating. That was my role. Right. The first wave, of course, was very different. The biggest difference was that you couldn't go out, right? So in the first wave, the risk was, well, we didn't know initially what the risk was. So it was still potentially as big a risk as the second wave. But the second wave became very clear very soon that this is much more lethal, right? So the biggest difference was you couldn't be physically present. I remember just around then, had I got my first shot? Oh, I was going to get my first shot. But I tested negative. I remember on a call saying that I've tested negative, I can go out if need be. But then we decided not to do that, and we decided not to do that for any of the organizations. So whereas last time for most activists and organizations, people were working in their area. So we were running, for instance, community kitchens, three of them in North Campus in Delhi University, in Wazirpur, and in Subhash Camp in near Britannia Chowk in North Delhi. So that the experience from that obviously helped a lot, right? In simply understanding areas, right? In building contacts there, making sure, also involving people from those areas who were instrumental in the second wave to do on locality based deliveries, etc. And finding out vendors, getting to know this group, right? So the second wave, the group got together because precisely this, people figured out in the first wave who is working where, right? So that obviously helped a lot. Right. So we had two models, right? So one was that you had vendors who could deliver across Delhi. So those who also had transport, right? So these were vendors who could operate at some scale. One of them was particularly instrumental in the work that we did. He could manage bulk deliveries. So this model would basically mean we collect demand. We tell this vendor, okay, 4,000 kits this week, right? And they have to go, so many have to go here, so many have to go here. This is the location, this is the contact person, etc., etc. So they would take care of that. The other was, if you're getting demand from an area where an organization has identified a local vendor, right, who can raise a proper GST bill, right? So And then in this model, what would happen is that the organization would either procure kits from the vendor themselves, right, and distribute it themselves, or they would ask people, beneficiaries, to come to the shop and take kits. So, but they would take charge of making sure that deliveries happen efficiently. In the first model, the vendor would basically go and make drops, right? So this would be for organizations that had capacity to store, right, and had a network through which then they could locally distribute. In the second one, uh, it all becomes decentralized. Here, you go and make drops. In the second one, people either come to the shop, or it's usually smaller orders also these, right? So they take the kits and they deliver them in the localities. The two models that I described before this were being done through a grant that had come in, right, from Azim Premji Foundation, right. The other UPI-based model was actually, because once you start this, you also start getting calls and you start getting requests which are not necessarily from the network, or the idea is, the protocol is, you have a meeting a week, right, in which everybody gives their demands, but then there'll be somebody who'll ask for something later on also. It'll be like, oh, there's a very dire case with this one family, or this 5 families, or these 12 families, small, but you can't accommodate them in this system, and you can't also let it go. So for that, because people knew that we were doing this, we'd actually done that as a parallel thing, where you'd get individual donors, and that was not part of this project, but it was running in parallel in terms of operations, where if you would find a shop in a locality, you had an activist who was willing to take responsibility for making sure that these are delivered to the right people. Then you just make a payment to the via UPI. You make a payment to the vendor, and they just procure it and give it right there. One is simply, I mean, what you're talking about is capacity at their end, right? So it would reflect in two things, I would say, to start off with. One is the list that they would give. Membership-based organizations give you exact lists, and you can kind of be sure, okay, it's going to be neat and tidy and everything. Whereas organizations that have a more dispersed outreach, right, who are low on resources themselves, struggle to turn out like really neat lists in a quick time frame. So you had to kind of go back to them a few times. The other thing was that many of these organizations, many of the membership-based organizations, or sort of like unions, etc., would have office spaces and would have storage spaces, would have dedicated volunteers or members in different localities in the city. Whereas other organizations had to manage on their own. So it was a bit of an apprehension on our part when we started, whether everyone will be able to manage at the same pace, because the network is running at a pace, right? But then will individual organizations be able to manage at the same pace? But they were able to manage. It was a very big apprehension, because if you get like 30, 35 organizations, when people are, a Zoom call between 5 people is difficult to manage, right? But and we would have 35, and they were all stakeholders. Everyone had something to contribute and something to take from these calls. So it was an apprehension at first. Will people be able to work together efficiently enough? I think what helped is the fact that we had an efficient system of working. So every week we were able to deliver on what was the demand that was mobilized. It was met every week. So had it been that regularly it was not being met, I'm sure some of these problems might have crept into the working of the network, but thankfully they didn't. Also, people, I think, really, all of us really appreciated the fact that, as opposed to the first lockdown, right, we were not able to go out. And so the fact that something was possible with its limitations, people still appreciated that. I did. I'm sure many others did as well. So they knew, okay, this is what is possible. This is how to get it done, and they could see it happening. Therefore, these problems didn't arise, and it worked pretty efficiently. Very pleasantly surprising. Yeah, so everyone could see the master list, right? And then we would keep delivery lists not visible to everyone. Not everyone need to see those, but everyone could see uh, what are the demands that have been logged in, right? So and they had there's a column for organization as well, so you could even tally which organization is getting how many kits if you want to, right? In which area is it going, etc. So all of this information is public. Only people who were managing this work could edit it, but everyone could see it, so it was transparent. And as deliveries kept happening, you'd change you'd color coordinate it in such a way that people had real-time information on this. And of course, they could reach out to any of us who were managing this work anytime. And this is most of that time was spent on the phone. So yeah, the transparency bit really helped. Yeah. So people who are mobilizing this demand, once it starts happening, they're also realizing there is this other unmet need, which is for sanitary pads, which is for children, right? It's a very legitimate demand. So and as it comes up, there's also a solution that comes from there. Okay, if we can modify it and make these kits like this for this locality. So then we devised a separate thing which was a children's kit. It had a different cost, and then we asked the network wherever we require children's kits, we can send this. So it kind of happened organically. I don't know if the comparison with the state is a meaningful comparison, because state departments and committees also work in mission mode and they solve problems really quickly. So this was kind of like civil society working in mission mode, right? So it was almost on a daily, on an hourly basis, there would be a problem and there would be somebody trying to fix it. But it was being done in a transparent manner. So everything would get raised in the weekly meeting. If there was anything else that came up that was significant, there was a WhatsApp group on which it would be raised, and others would contribute to it as well. So this decision to make a children's kit, for instance, was roundly appreciated. For instance, and it's a fairly simple problem. Once you understand what you need to do, it's a fairly simple problem. You just ask the vendor to quickly make. Tell us the vendor is willing to sell, right? If they have transportation facilities, it's not extra work for them. So it's actually not such a tedious problem. And I think the state can and I'm sure does, when it wants to, work in the same fashion. So it depends how you define or delimit work, right? So if you're talking about a specific project, then that ended in July, right? Which is the delivery of the ration kits from a specific fund, etc. But if you're talking about the network still exists as a WhatsApp group, information is shared on it even today. It also spawned smaller other groups. So if you remember, just around the same time, around June, July, there was an order in the Supreme Court saying that you have to make a national database of unorganized workers, right? So the e-Shram thing came about. So it was many people from the same network who, I'm not saying it's because there was a network that this other thing started, but it had already mobilized people, right? In a certain way, they already knew who is who, etc. So the same set of people were then working on how do we get people to register for e-Shram, trying to understand what will be delivered via e-Shram, trying to also speak to labor commissioners. I remember meeting many of the same people from the network at the labor commissioner's office, for instance. So that is one instance in which it continued. Another way in which it continued was actually a smaller number of organizations worked as a network to do vaccinations in many of the bastis in the city. So that was a very, as a project kind of mode of working. People did continue to do that as well. So it depends on how you define it. So one is how do you synergies, right? How do you leverage each other's? It worked because everyone was involved, right? That's why you could work at scale. That's why you could be efficient. That's why everything. The second thing is that it has potential for, and this is something that even in the first wave we thought, because you get to know a lot of people who are working and who have a perspective on what this problem is, what are the underlying causes of it, etc. So it leads to a possibility of those kind of partnerships developing, which I'm sure did develop for some people through this network. So, and in terms of learning, I think it is, to me, I would actually go back to the first wave, when it comes to something significant that I kind of took away from it, which was that before the first wave, right, there was actually violence in part of Northeast Delhi, right? And a lot of civil society actors and public spirited citizens were involved in that, in relief and documentation work post that violence. Many of the same people continued to work even afterwards, right? And they were very important actors in the city because the state was absent, right? For doing food relief, trying to send people home, trying to arrange for some medical requirements of somebody or the other. And these were all people who got to know each other because they came to help in a certain area, or they came. There's a real public spiritedness behind these kind of initiatives, right? And that really got damaged, I would say, with all the repression and the kind of court cases that we've seen happen in Delhi. Not just for the people who have been targeted, but also it created a kind of sentiment where people who had actually, without monetary or other incentives, come together just as acts of solidarity, started being apprehensive. You don't know who is who, So if you allow for, and that, so the point I'm making in a sense is my broader point about democracy, right? This is an authoritarian kind of action of the state that then really dissuades you not to do some things that are very, very important. Especially in a country like India, where you talk about when you talk about it practically, we often talk about the lack of state capacity and therefore the need for other initiatives, non-state actors or actors working in tandem with the state, which is what you eventually end up doing. You do work with the state, You're not setting up anything parallelly. You have to work with the state. But just this act, right, of the government being repressive and vindictive, can really bust this energy that is very useful. And what happened in the second wave actually happened despite all of this. So people were still apprehensive, but people came together because it is frustrating to sit at home and see what's happening outside, to get the kind of calls that you get, and to think that, oh, you're in the same city, you're living comfortably, whereas somebody else is not. And the pandemic and the lockdowns is that. Now, the lockdown wasn't just a story of misery. It is also a story of filled up pantries, comfortably filled up pantries, people delivering food home if you can pay for it, whereas people not having food. I mean, the kind of messages and pictures that we received. But it's a relational thing, right? So people, sorry, to come back to the point, people really, despite this atmosphere, right, of a bit of distrust, of a risk of, can we be seen by the state to be doing something like this? Will they think we're doing something else? That kind of thing, despite that, people came together. For everyday emergencies, this kind of action, especially action of civil society, etc., is actually perhaps not the answer. The answer is to get the state to address these things, because only the state can address these things at scale, the scale at which the problem exists, really. So, and to go back to this in the first wave, right? So, I was part of this initiative called Workers' Dhaba, right, which I just described to you earlier. This was a question for us as well, because we ran it for about 7 months, and after that the question, 6 months, 7 months, after that the question was, do we stop? Because the need for food, even if you go out today, it's not like, as you said, the food security is a big question for most, I would say, hardworking, honest, poor working people in the city. So if you are giving decent food out on the street, people do bhandaras all the time, right? And they're always full, right? So there is a requirement for that. The answer to that, I don't think is civil society has a role to play in that, for sure. Citizens have a role to play in that, but the onus of that lies on the state, and the thing should be to get the state to do its bit. Now, how can civil society work in that formulation is a legitimate question. The other question, when there is a crisis, yes, because I think we have now an experience of a well-functioning network, a process, right, that was built. I think it is possible for people to, and I think people will go back to this if something like this happens again. In terms of this being an enduring kind of, an institution or something, I think that is up to. And there are other considerations also that come in. In emergencies, of course, you come together, but to sustain that, you need more common understanding, more of a shared perspective between organizations, which develops over time. So. Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you're asking a question, does it have potential? Yeah, it does. And networks also adapt, also change. They're supple, right? So depending on the question, depending on the interest that members of the network show. As I said, right, there were several other things that happened with members of this network, right? So the vaccination thing, the e-shram thing, etc. So yes, definitely it has potential to address other problems, and specifically what we're talking about, if I can define it that way, one of the key things is migrant workers, right? And that in Delhi we know, but we don't know. So, and it's crazy the extent to which we know that we don't know, yet we continue to not know. So this network can really help. So I would say, for instance, the e-shram thing was actually a very good case where the network could. I mean, it didn't work as the Delhi Coordinated Relief Network, whatever, but there was a separate group that got formed for that. Through that, to hold the state accountable, through that, to have awareness in the city, in the areas that you're in, and to provide the state with information that, okay, like you said, here are these workers, here is information that we can give you, which they did. For the e-shram, there was a pilot that was rolled out, which was basically done by civil society and by trade unions, etc. So it definitely has potential. I think establishing trust with community organizations, civil society organizations, which effectively are community organizations in many places. Many of the organizations that we have in the network are that, right? Which have, like we were discussing, deep roots in the community. So they will be able to manage not just delivery and all of that, but also there are n number of tensions that play out in a locality. So but because they are rooted there, they can manage those. So for the state, they're actually an asset. If they work in tandem, if they work together, they can actually deliver effective social protection if they have a trust and a shared kind of understanding of what we want to do, how do we want to do it. But what we have, unfortunately, not just in Delhi, what we have are structures of patronage, etc., which have a way of working, but they work very differently. They're not democratic. They're inefficient. So what you can rather have is a institutionalization of working relationships with community-based civil society and trade union type organizations. Just to know, okay, what kind of work is being done where, what are the limits of the city, and what kind of work is being done where, who is doing it, where are workers living with families, where are they living as individuals. So it makes you think of the city in a very different way, for sure. I would say that, and also then you can, I think you have it helps you in terms of your work, but I think it also helps you in terms of generally having a sense of the place that you're in and of the world. So it depends on what they want to roll out, right? Because here the initiative, as in is implicit in your question, the initiative is with the state, right? So depending on what they want to roll out, I mean, social protection is a whole gamut of things, right? So if you want to talk about any of them, this is a ready-made social infrastructure that the state can access. So then the question is, what is it that you want to do with it?
So you believe that there is possibility to
For
do
sure.
more?
Yeah. Definitely.